Hi, I will be presenting on the research question, is traffic fatality rate related to mandatory community service and jail time? If so, how? And my name is Sarah Newts. So here's my table of contents, and I will be discussing about the introduction, some preliminary answers based on descriptive statistics, a statistical analysis, and my results and conclusion. First, I'm going to start off with my introduction. So, my hypothesis to my research question is that there will be a significant difference between mean traffic fatality rates across mandatory jail time and across community service. I chose this topic because I have a personal relationship to traffic fatality victims and a personal relationship to alcoholics. I also have a passion to make educated voting choices. This is relevant to everyone in society because one person every 50 minutes dies due to a drunk driving accident. There were 10,511 drunk driving deaths from 2018. I think it is very important that we learn from the past and see what laws are most effective at reducing traffic related fatalities. For my dataset, I used a simple random sampling method, which brought my sample size from 336 down to 250. My variables that were in my dataset were JLID, or mandatory jail time, ComCert, or mandatory community service, MRAL, or traffic fatality rate in deaths per 100,000, beer tax in percent, MITA, which is minimum drinking age, measured in years, PAIR Inc., which was the per capita personal income, UNRATE, which is the unemployment rate, and VMiles, which is the average miles per driver. However, to answer my specific research question, I chose to focus on the variables JLID, ComCert, and MRAL. Here is a relative frequency of ComCert and JLID. This is showing the relative frequency bar graphs of mandatory community service and mandatory jail time in my dataset, and I'm focusing on how these variables relate to traffic fatality rate because they yielded the most significant results in relation to my original question about exploring how drunk driving related laws affected traffic fatality rate. So as you can see, there's a higher frequency of mandatory jail time than mandatory community service, and in general, no community service and jail time is more frequent for both. Here is a grouped relative frequency of ComCert and JLID. As you can see, the combination of no community service and no jail time is most common, and community service is more frequent when jail time is also mandatory. I found this grouped relative frequency quite interesting. However, for my research question, I'm more focusing on how each ComCert and JLID individually relate to the traffic fatality rate, but I think it's quite interesting to see them grouped as well. So, some preliminary answers to my research question based on descriptive statistics. I used a box plot of traffic fatality rate versus mandatory jail time, which is grouped by yes or no on the left. And you can see this does show homostaticity if the outliers were removed. On the right, you can see a side-by-side mean bar plot of mandatory jail time and mandatory traffic fatality rate. You can visualize that there is a higher traffic fatality rate mean for yes mandatory jail time than for no. And as you can see, there is most likely a significant difference between yes and no jail time because you cannot draw a line across the error bars, as you can see with this animation. And just to repeat, there is a higher mean traffic fatality rate for the yes in this. Here's the same thing. It is a box plot of traffic fatality rate versus mandatory community service this time, grouped by yes or no on the left. And you can see if this also shows homostaticity if the outliers were removed. And on the right, you can see another side-by-side mean bar plot, but this time of mandatory community service and traffic fatality rate. You can visualize that there is a higher traffic fatality rate mean for yes mandatory community service than for no. This is the same trend that we saw with the mandatory jail time. And you can also see that there's most likely a significant difference between yes and no community service because you cannot draw a line across the error bars. And this will be further assessed using a t-test. Here's another animation that you cannot draw the line across the error bars. So now this slide is showing the standard deviation and means of traffic fatality rate across mandatory jail time and also of it across mandatory community service. So you can see uh, numerically, as we just saw visually, that there is a higher mean traffic fatality rate when there is mandatory jail time rather than no mandatory jail time, and that there's also a higher mean traffic fatality rate when there is mandatory community service than no mandatory community service. So now I'm going to go into my statistical analysis where I do a t-test analysis. So my original claims for my t-test for mandatory jail time across traffic fatality rate, my claim was that there is a significant difference in the mean traffic fatality rate between yes and no mandatory jail time. And my claim for community service against traffic fatality rate is that there is a significant difference in the mean traffic fatality rate between yes and no mandatory community service. So as you can see, these are quite similar for each because I did see the same visual trends on both in my descriptive statistics. So my null and alternative hypothesis. So for mandatory jail time and across traffic fatality rate, the null hypothesis is that there is no significant difference in the mean traffic fatality rate between yes and no mandatory jail time. And my alternative is that there is a significant difference in the mean traffic fatality rate between yes and no mandatory jail time. And so you'll see that my mandatory community service null and alternative are quite similar, as the null is there is no significant difference in the mean traffic fatality rate between yes and no mandatory community service, and the alternative is that there is a significant difference in the mean traffic fatality rate between yes and no mandatory community service. Here are my t-test results. As you can see, for mandatory jail time across MRAL or traffic fatality rate, the p-value is 1.5607 e to the negative 05 with a t-statistic of negative 4.4071. So you can see that there's quite a high t-statistic and that there is quite a low p-value. So this is why I'm saying that there's a significant difference. And then for ComCert, you can see the same trends, that there is in fact significant difference because of the low p-value and the relatively high t-statistic, and this is at a 5% or 0.5 significance level. So my decision based on the t-test for MRAL versus JLID, or mandatory jail time, is using the 5% significance, we had sufficient evidence to reject the null hypothesis in favor of the alternative, that there was significant difference between the mean traffic fatality rate and yes or no mandatory jail time. My decision was quite similar for community service again, and it was using the 5% significance. We had sufficient evidence to reject the null hypothesis in favor of the alternative, that there was significant difference between mean traffic fatality rate and yes or no mandatory jail time. So in conclusion, for the t-test of mandatory jail time versus traffic fatality rate, it is the sample data supports the claim that there is a significant difference between the mean traffic fatality rate and yes or no mandatory jail time. I came to a very similar conclusion in terms of mandatory community service. The sample data supports the claim that there was significant difference between the mean traffic fatality rate and yes or no mandatory community service. So a little bit about normality and homoscedasticity of my data with the t-test. So my homoscedasticity was satisfied for both JLID and ComCert, and you can see that because I had a higher p-value than 0.005 or 5% significance level, as they were actually both the same, 0.15259, and so this means that they were satisfied, and my normality wasn't satisfied, unfortunately, even though they both had a p-value above 0.05 for yes at a level 0.24956. However, the no was below the 5% significance level, and so this is why we had to reject it. However, I can still assume that there is relative normality just because my sample size was large enough. And so some of my results and conclusions So my overall results to the question is traffic fatality rate related to mandatory community service and jail time and how. So for mandatory jail time, I said higher mean fatality rate when there's mandatory jail time than no mandatory jail time. And this was confirmed as you can see based on the descriptive statistics that I could draw the error. I could not draw a line between the error bars, and then my t-test also confirmed that there was a significant difference. And for mandatory community service, I said there was a higher median fatality rate when there is mandatory community service than no mandatory community service. And once again, this was confirmed using the same statistical tests. So, in analysis, mandatory jail time and mandatory community service as a punishment for drunk driving are both correlated to a higher mean traffic fatality rate. A plausible explanation for these results could be that there are areas with higher traffic fatality rates implement stricter drunk driving punishments, and this would make sense because based on my research, a large portion of traffic accidents are due to drunk driving. However, there may be other explanations or variables that play a role. And this leads me to some limitations for my analysis. So this is saying correlation and not causation, which is very important. And I also had a limited data sample. This data sample was quite dated as it took place in the 80s and 90s. And I also would want to look at other variables in conjunction to traffic fatality rate. And in the future, I would like to add more variables in conjunction to the ones analyzed today. And I would like to search for a more recent data set, do some more research into why and when these laws were implemented. So in conclusion, for my research question, mandatory jail time and mandatory community service, there's a significantly higher mean traffic fatality rate. And this is impactful to the field because it suggests that there is a trend between harsher punishments and a higher traffic fatality rate. It is worth investigating whether harsher punishments could actually lead to more accidents, or if it agrees more with my plausible explanation before, just that this is a correlation and there's actually no causation, but it's definitely worth further investigation. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a happy holidays and enjoy your winter break.